The morning sun rose slowly over the small town of Cedar Falls, Tennessee, casting long golden shadows across the quiet suburban streets where modest homes stood like silent witnesses to decades of ordinary lives. Margaret Ellen Calloway stood at her kitchen window, a cup of lukewarm coffee trembling slightly in her hands as she watched the autumn leaves dance across her overgrown front yard. 2 years, 3 months, and 17 days since Richard had passed, and still every sunrise felt like a reminder of the empty space beside her in the bed, the silence where his laughter used to fill the rooms, the absence that had become her constant companion. At 52 years old, Margaret had spent 30 years as a registered nurse at Cedar Falls General Hospital, caring for the sick and the dying, holding hands in the darkest hours, whispering comfort to strangers who became family in their final moments. She had seen death approach with both fury and gentleness, had learned to recognize its footsteps in the corridors of the oncology ward, had made peace with its inevitability long before it came for the man she loved. But nothing had prepared her for the loneliness that followed, the way grief could hollow out a person until they felt like a shell going through the motions of living. The fence along the eastern property line had been falling apart for months now. Richard had always taken care of such things, his calloused hands working the wood and nails with the same quiet competence he had brought to everything he touched. Now 3 sections had collapsed entirely, and Margaret had neither the strength nor the knowledge to repair them herself. She had called several contractors, received estimates that made her modest pension seem even more inadequate, and eventually resigned herself to living with the decay. It was just a fence, after all. Just another thing falling apart. The sound of a motorcycle engine broke through her morning reverie, loud and rumbling, the kind of sound that usually made her neighbors peer through their curtains with disapproval. Cedar Falls was a quiet community, a place where church bells marked the hours and everyone knew everyone else's business. Bikers passing through were tolerated but rarely welcomed, their leather and chrome and reputation preceding them like a warning. But this motorcycle did not pass through. It stopped. Margaret watched as a large man swung his leg over the bike, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He wore a leather vest over a faded flannel shirt, his arms thick with tattoos that told stories she could not read from this distance. His hair was gray at the temples, pulled back in a short ponytail, and when he removed his sunglasses, she could see eyes that seemed to carry their own kind of weariness. He was perhaps 60 years old, maybe older, with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades facing both sun and storm. What happened next made Margaret set down her coffee cup with a clatter. The man walked directly to her broken fence, opened the gate to her backyard as if he belonged there, and began pulling tools from a saddlebag on his motorcycle. Within minutes, he was kneeling in the grass, examining the rotted posts, measuring the damage with the practiced eye of someone who had done this work before. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She should call someone, the police perhaps, or at least one of her neighbors. Strange men did not simply appear at widows' homes and start working on their property. In the news, in the stories that circulated through the hospital break room, such scenarios rarely ended well for women alone. But something held her back. Perhaps it was the careful way he handled the wood, or the gentle manner in which he moved her potted plants out of his way. Perhaps it was simply the exhaustion of 2 years spent being afraid of everything, of jumping at shadows and locking doors against a world that suddenly seemed full of threats. Whatever the reason, Margaret found herself walking to her back door, stepping onto the porch, and calling out to the stranger in her yard. "Excuse me." The words came out stronger than she felt. "Can I help you with something?" The man looked up, and in that moment Margaret saw something shift in his expression. It was recognition, though she was certain they had never met. His eyes moved across her face like he was reading a familiar book, and when he spoke, his voice was rough but gentle. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. It was not a question. Margaret's hand found the porch railing, steadying herself. "Do I know you?" The man stood slowly, wiping his hands on his jeans, and walked toward her with the measured pace of someone approaching a frightened animal. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, maintaining a respectful distance, and looked up at her with eyes that suddenly seemed wet. "No, ma'am," he said, "but I knew your husband. Richard saved my life." The words hung in the autumn air, like leaves suspended before falling. Margaret felt the world tilt slightly, felt the familiar ache of grief rise in her chest, felt something else too. Something like hope, or curiosity, or the first crack of light through a door that had been closed for too long. The man's name was Cole Brennan. He had been a patient at Cedar Falls General 12 years ago, brought in after a motorcycle accident that had left him with internal bleeding and a collapsed lung. He had been given a 12% chance of survival. Richard, who had been working the emergency department that night, had refused to accept those odds. Margaret invited Cole inside, her hands shaking as she prepared fresh coffee, her mind racing through memories of that time. Richard had never spoken much about his work at home, had carried the weight of his patient's suffering quietly, had believed that what happened in the hospital should stay there. She had never known about Cole Brennan, had never heard the story of the biker who should have died but did not. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret had eaten breakfast alone for over 2 years, and Cole told her everything. How Richard had stayed with him through the night, monitoring his vitals, adjusting his treatment, arguing with other doctors who wanted to call time of death. How Richard had held his hand when the pain became unbearable, had spoken to him about hope and fight and the reasons to keep breathing. How Richard had visited him every day during his 3-week recovery, bringing books and conversation and the kind of human connection that had been absent from Cole's life for decades. "He changed everything for me," Cole said, his rough voice cracking slightly. "I was nobody, an ex-con, a man with nothing and no one. And he treated me like I mattered, like my life was worth fighting for." Margaret wiped her eyes with a paper napkin, the grief and gratitude mixing in her chest until she could barely distinguish between them. Richard had been that kind of man. The kind who saw value in everyone, who believed that every life had purpose, who spent himself completely in service of others until there was nothing left. It was what made him a great nurse. It was also what killed him, the heart attack coming after a double shift, his body finally giving out after years of giving too much. Cole had spent the years since his recovery trying to find ways to repay the debt. He had gotten sober, had reconnected with his estranged daughter, had joined a motorcycle club that focused on community service rather than the outlaw activities of his youth. When he learned of Richard's death through the hospital grapevine, he had wanted to attend the funeral but had not known how to approach a grieving widow who had never met him. So he had waited, watching from a distance, checking on the house when he passed through town, noting the slow deterioration of the property with growing concern. "The fence was the last straw," he admitted. "I drove by last week and saw it falling apart, and I thought about how much Richard would have hated seeing his home like this. So I decided to stop waiting and start helping. I hope that's okay." Margaret looked at this stranger, this rough man with his tattoos and his leather and his tears, and she saw something she had not seen in a very long time. She saw the legacy of her husband's kindness, the ripples spreading outward long after the stone had sunk. She saw that Richard's life had mattered in ways she had never known, that his compassion had touched people she would never meet, that his spirit lived on in the actions of those he had helped. "It's more than okay," she said. "It's the first thing that's felt right in 2 years." Cole returned to the fence, and Margaret watched from the kitchen window as he worked, his hands moving with skill and care, transforming the broken sections into something sturdy and new. She thought about all the things Richard had built in their 30 years of marriage, the home, the garden, the life they had shared. She thought about how quickly everything could fall apart when the builder was gone, and she thought about how unexpected the help could be when it finally arrived. By the end of the day, the fence was repaired. Cole had replaced the rotted posts, reinforced the weak sections, and even painted the whole thing a fresh coat of white. He refused any payment, refused even to stay for dinner, insisted that this was just the beginning of what he owed. "I'll be back next week," he said, straddling his motorcycle. "There's a lot more work to be done around here, and I've got a lot more time than money. If you'll let me, I'd like to help you get this place back in shape. For Richard." Margaret stood on her porch, watching the motorcycle disappear down the street, and she felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt hope. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you have ever felt the power of unexpected kindness, if you believe that the people we help can become the angels who return to help us, then you understand why this story matters. Subscribe now and be part of a community that believes in the redemption of human goodness. The following weeks brought changes to the Calloway house that the neighbors noticed with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The motorcycle appeared regularly now, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by others. The quiet suburban street that had never seen more than the occasional Harley passing through was now hosting what appeared to be an entire motorcycle club, their bikes lined up along the curb like chrome soldiers at attention. Margaret's daughter, Emily, was the first to express her worry. She lived 3 hours away in Nashville, visited rarely due to her demanding job as a corporate attorney, and relied on phone calls to monitor her mother's well-being. When she heard about the bikers, her voice took on the sharp edge of alarm. "Mom, you need to be careful," she said, the phone pressed tightly against Margaret's ear. "These people are strangers. You don't know anything about them. They could be taking advantage of you." "They're not taking advantage," Margaret replied, watching through the window as Cole and 2 other men installed new shutters on the front of the house. "They're helping." "But why?" Emily demanded. "People don't just help for no reason. There's always something they want." Margaret thought about that question as she hung up the phone, thought about the cynicism that had crept into her daughter's worldview, thought about how different Emily's life had become from the small-town values she had been raised with. Emily saw the world through the lens of contracts and negotiations, of give and take and hidden agendas. She could not understand that sometimes people helped simply because they had been helped themselves. That kindness could be passed along like a torch in the darkness. The motorcycle club was called the Iron Guardians, and they had chapters throughout Tennessee and the surrounding states. Their members were mostly veterans, former first responders, and others who had served their communities in various capacities before finding brotherhood on the road. They did charity rides for children's hospitals, escorted funeral processions for fallen service members, and organized annual toy drives that filled the beds of pickup trucks with gifts for underprivileged kids. Cole was one of the founding members, a Vietnam veteran who had spent decades running from the memories of what he had seen and done before finding peace and service to others. He had brought Margaret's situation to the club's monthly meeting, had explained who Richard was and what he had done, and had asked for volunteers to help restore the widow's home. The response had been unanimous. "We take care of our own," Cole explained to Margaret during one of his visits. "And your husband?" "He was one of us. He just never wore the leather." Over the course of 2 months, the Iron Guardians transformed the Calloway property. They replaced the aging roof, their members who worked in construction donating their time and skills. They repainted the exterior, fixed the broken gutters, and rebuilt the sagging front porch where Richard used to sit in the evenings watching the sunset. They cleared the overgrown garden, planted new flowers, and installed a small memorial bench beneath the oak tree where Richard had proposed 32 years ago. Margaret found herself cooking for them, filling her kitchen with the smells of home-cooked meals that had been absent since Richard's death. She learned their names, their stories, their wounds. There was Jackson, a former firefighter who had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier. There was Maria, one of the few women in the club, a retired Army medic who had served 2 tours in Iraq. There was Tommy, barely 30 years old, who had lost his leg to an IED in Afghanistan and now rode a specially modified motorcycle that allowed him to feel the freedom his body could no longer give him. They were broken people, Margaret realized. All of them. Carrying their grief and their scars and their memories like invisible weights. But they had found each other, had built something from the fragments of their individual pain, had created a family out of shared suffering and mutual respect. It reminded her of the hospital, of the bonds that formed between nurses who witnessed things together that no one else could understand. It reminded her of Richard, of the way he had seen past the surface of people to the struggling souls beneath. It reminded her of what she had lost, and slowly, tentatively, it began to show her what she might find again. The trouble started on a Thursday afternoon when a black sedan pulled into Margaret's driveway and a man in an expensive suit stepped out, briefcase in hand. His name was Gerald Whitmore, and he represented a development company that had been buying properties throughout the Cedar Falls area. He had heard about the widow living alone in the old house, had seen an opportunity in her vulnerability, and had come to make an offer. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, his smile too wide and his handshake too firm, "I represent Whitmore Development Corporation. We're very interested in acquiring properties in this neighborhood for a new residential community we're planning. I'm prepared to offer you $300,000 for your home. Cash. No contingencies." Margaret stared at him, this polished stranger with his cologne and his confidence, and she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt anger. "This is my home," she said. "It's not for sale." Gerald's smile flickered but did not fade. "I understand your attachment," he said, "but let's be practical. This is a large property for a woman living alone. The maintenance must be overwhelming. And I've done some research. Your husband's medical bills were substantial. His life insurance only covered so much. You're struggling, Mrs. Calloway. I'm offering you a way out." The personal nature of his knowledge made Margaret's skin crawl. How did he know about Richard's medical bills? About the life insurance? About the financial strain she had been under before the Iron Guardians had reduced her home maintenance costs to zero? "I'm not struggling," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "And I'm not selling. Please leave." Gerald's smile disappeared entirely now, replaced by something harder, something that made Margaret take a step backward toward her front door. "You should reconsider," he said. "Properties in this area are going to become very valuable very soon. It would be a shame if something happened to decrease your home's worth before you had a chance to sell. Structural problems, permit issues, code violations. These old houses have so many potential problems." The threat was barely veiled, and Margaret understood it clearly. This man was not here to make a fair offer. He was here to intimidate her into selling, to use her widowhood and her age and her isolation as weapons against her. "Leave," she said again. "Now." Gerald reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, placing it on the porch railing with deliberate slowness. "Think about it," he said. "Call me when you're ready to be reasonable." He walked back to his sedan, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel, and drove away without looking back. Margaret stood on her porch, the business card feeling like a curse in her hand, and she tried to control the fear that was rising in her chest. She was alone. She was vulnerable. And she had just made an enemy of someone who clearly had the resources to make her life very difficult. She did not know that Cole was watching from across the street, having arrived for his regular Thursday visit just as the black sedan was pulling into her driveway. She did not know that he had heard every word through his open motorcycle helmet, his ears trained by decades of vigilance to pick up conversations from a distance. She did not know that his hand was already reaching for his phone, ready to make calls that would set a very different sequence of events in motion. The following morning, Margaret woke to find 6 motorcycles parked in front of her house. Cole was on her porch before she had finished her first cup of coffee, his face grave and his eyes hard. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning." Margaret told him about Gerald Whitmore, about the offer and the threats, about the way he had known things he should not have known. As she spoke, she watched Cole's expression shift from concern to cold fury, the transformation so complete that she glimpsed for the first time the man he must have been in Vietnam, the warrior beneath the gentle exterior. When she finished, Cole was silent for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. "Brother," he said to whoever answered, "we've got a problem. Someone's targeting Richard's widow. I need you to run a name for me. Gerald Whitmore. Whitmore Development Corporation. Find out everything." He hung up and turned to Margaret, his voice softening. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "Whatever this is, we're going to handle it. Together." The information came quickly. One of the Iron Guardians had a cousin who worked in commercial real estate, another had connections to the county assessor's office, and a third had access to public records databases through his job as a private investigator. Within 48 hours, they had assembled a picture of Gerald Whitmore that was far darker than his expensive suits suggested. Whitmore Development Corporation was a shell company, one of several used by a larger entity to acquire properties through questionable means. Their preferred targets were the elderly, the widowed, and the financially vulnerable. Those who refused their initial offers often found themselves facing a cascade of problems. Code violations appeared out of nowhere. Property taxes were suddenly reassessed at higher values, and mysterious accidents occurred that decreased the value of their homes until selling became the only option. 3 elderly homeowners in neighboring counties had already lost their properties this way. One had died of a heart attack shortly after being forced from the home where he had lived for 40 years. Another was now in a nursing home, her family unable to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. "This is not just about money," Cole told the assembled Iron Guardians at an emergency meeting in Margaret's living room. "This is about preying on people who can't fight back. People like the ones we swore to protect." The room was full of nodding heads, clenched jaws, the quiet anger of people who had spent their lives standing between the vulnerable and those who would harm them. They were not vigilantes. They did not operate outside the law, but they knew how to use every legal resource available to ensure that the Whitmore Development Corporation would never touch Margaret Calloway or anyone like her again. If you are feeling this story in your chest right now, if your heart is beating faster because you know what it means to be protected when you thought you were alone, leave a comment with the words, "Not on our watch." Let the world know that there are still people who stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves. The investigation expanded beyond what anyone had expected. Jackson, the former firefighter, reached out to contacts in the county fire department and discovered that several of the accidents that had befallen Whitmore's targets had suspicious origins. Fires that started in electrical systems that had been inspected and cleared just months before, water damage from pipes that showed signs of deliberate tampering, evidence that would not hold up in court on its own, but painted a disturbing pattern when viewed together. Maria, the Army medic, used her network of veteran contacts to track down other victims of Whitmore's schemes. She spent hours on the phone, listening to elderly voices trembling with grief and confusion, documenting their stories with the same attention to detail she had once used in combat zones. By the end of the week, she had identified 8 additional families who had been pressured or forced to sell their properties at far below market value. Tommy, despite his youth, proved to be a genius with computers. He mapped the acquisitions, identified the pattern, connected the shell companies to their parent organization, and eventually traced the whole operation back to a man named Harrison Burke, a wealthy developer with political connections and a reputation for getting what he wanted through any means necessary. Gerald Whitmore was just the front man, Cole explained to Margaret during one of their now daily conversations. Burke is the one pulling the strings. He's got connections to city council members, county officials, even some state legislators. He's been doing this for years and no one's been able to stop him because he's always got someone in his pocket who can make the investigations go away. Margaret thought about Richard, about his quiet belief that every person mattered, that every injustice deserved to be challenged regardless of the power of those committing it. She thought about all the times he had advocated for patients against insurance companies, against hospital administrators, against anyone who put profit above humanity. He had never won every battle, but he had never stopped fighting. "What do we do?" she asked. Cole smiled, and in that smile, Margaret saw both the warrior and the healer, the man who had learned to fight and the man who had learned to save. "We do what Richard would have done," he said. "We make noise. We shine light. And we don't stop until everyone sees what's happening." The first step was gathering all the evidence they had collected and presenting it to the local newspaper. The Cedar Falls Gazette was a small publication, but its editor, a woman named Patricia Mendez, had made her career by exposing corruption and refusing to be intimidated. She listened to the Iron Guardian's presentation with growing interest, asked probing questions, and by the end of the meeting had assigned her best investigative journalist to the story. The second step was contacting a consumer protection attorney in Nashville, a man named David Chen who specialized in cases involving elder fraud and predatory business practices. David was initially skeptical, the kind of skepticism that came from years of seeing powerful people escape consequences for their actions. But as he reviewed the evidence, his skepticism turned to outrage. "This is one of the most organized elder targeting schemes I've ever seen," he said, during a conference call with Cole, Margaret, and several other Iron Guardians. "They've got a whole system. Identify vulnerable homeowners, make lowball offers, and when the offers are refused, make the homeowners' lives so difficult that selling becomes the only option. It's not technically illegal in any single action, but taken together, it shows a pattern of fraud, harassment, and potentially criminal conspiracy. "Can you stop them?" Margaret asked. "I can try," David replied, "but I'm going to need help. I'm going to need the victims willing to come forward. I'm going to need media attention to put pressure on the officials who've been looking the other way. And I'm going to need people on the ground who can coordinate all of this without being intimidated." "You've got all of that," Cole said. "The Iron Guardians don't intimidate easily." The campaign began quietly, with phone calls and meetings and careful documentation. But within weeks, it had grown into something much larger. The Cedar Falls Gazette published a front-page story about Whitmore Development Corporation and its parent company, Burke Enterprises. The story named names, cited specific cases, and included quotes from elderly victims who had finally found the courage to speak out. The response was immediate and fierce. Harrison Burke issued a statement calling the allegations baseless and threatening legal action against anyone who repeated them. Gerald Whitmore disappeared from Cedar Falls entirely, his office suddenly vacant, his phone number disconnected. County officials who had previously been cooperative became evasive, citing ongoing investigations they claimed prevented them from commenting. But the Iron Guardians did not back down. They organized a peaceful demonstration outside the county courthouse, their motorcycles lined up in a formation that stretched for 2 blocks. They wore their leather vests with pride, their military patches visible, their American flags fluttering in the breeze. They held signs with the names and faces of Burke's victims, silent witnesses to the corruption that had been allowed to flourish in the shadows. Margaret stood among them, this woman who had spent her life caring for others in quiet ways, who had never imagined herself as an activist or a crusader. She thought about Richard, about what he would say if he could see her now. She knew he would be proud. She knew he would be right there beside her, holding his own sign, raising his own voice against injustice. The demonstration attracted television cameras from Nashville, and suddenly the story was no longer just a local matter. State legislators began distancing themselves from Harrison Burke. The state attorney general announced an investigation into Burke Enterprises and its business practices. And families who had lost their homes began to hope that they might finally see justice. The breakthrough came 6 weeks later, when a former employee of Burke Enterprises came forward with internal documents that showed the systematic nature of the scheme. Emails discussing target acquisition strategies that focused specifically on widows and the elderly. Memos outlining ways to create pressure events that would force reluctant homeowners to sell. Records of payments to local officials who looked the other way when complaints were filed. The evidence was damning, and it was enough. Harrison Burke was arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and elder targeting. Gerald Whitmore was apprehended in Florida, where he had fled hoping to escape the consequences of his actions. 12 other associates of Burke Enterprises were charged with various offenses related to the scheme. The trial lasted 3 months and ended with convictions for Burke and Whitmore on multiple counts. Burke was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Whitmore received 8. The families who had been victimized were awarded damages that would allow many of them to reclaim their properties or at least receive fair compensation for their losses. Margaret attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row of the gallery with Cole beside her. She watched as the powerful were held accountable, as justice was served through the proper channels, as the system that had failed so many finally functioned as it was supposed to. She thought about Richard, about his unwavering belief that doing the right thing mattered even when the odds seemed impossible. On the day of the sentencing, as Harrison Burke was led away in handcuffs, Cole turned to Margaret with tears in his eyes. "He saved my life," Cole said. "And because he saved my life, I was here to help save these families. The ripples just keep spreading, don't they?" Margaret took his hand. This man who had been a stranger just months ago and was now family in every way that mattered. "That's how it works," she said. "That's how it's supposed to work. One act of kindness leads to another, and another. And before you know it, you've changed the world." The months that followed were ones of healing and transformation. Margaret's home, fully restored by the Iron Guardians, became a gathering place for the club and the families they had helped. Sunday dinners became a tradition, the long table in her backyard filled with people who had found each other through tragedy and emerged as a community of hope. Emily came to visit more often now, her initial skepticism replaced by grudging admiration and eventually genuine affection for the people who had become her mother's chosen family. She saw the way the Iron Guardians treated Margaret, with respect and tenderness and the kind of protective love that transcended blood relations. She saw the way her mother had changed, the grief that had weighed her down for 2 years, lifting like morning fog in sunlight. "Mom," Emily said during one of her visits, watching a group of bikers help Margaret plant a new rose garden, "I was wrong. About all of this. About them." "You were worried," Margaret replied. "That's what daughters do. But sometimes the people who look the scariest are the ones with the biggest hearts. Your father knew that. He saw past the surface to what was underneath. That's why Cole is alive today. That's why all of this exists." The Iron Guardians formalized their relationship with Margaret, making her an honorary member of the club and presenting her with a leather vest that bore Richard's name on the back, along with the words, "Forever our brother." She wore it to club events and charity rides. This widow who had never imagined herself on the back of a motorcycle, but who now felt more alive than she had in years. She also found a new purpose. Working with David Chen, the attorney who had prosecuted the case against Burke Enterprises, Margaret helped establish a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting elderly homeowners from predatory practices. The Richard Callaway Foundation, as it was called, provided legal assistance, advocacy, and community support to vulnerable people facing pressure to sell their homes. Cole became the foundation's most visible spokesperson, traveling throughout the state to raise awareness and recruit volunteers. He spoke at community centers, churches, and veterans organizations, sharing his story of how one nurse's compassion had set in motion a chain of events that was now helping hundreds of people. Richard never saw himself as a hero, Cole told these audiences. He just saw people who needed help and decided to help them. That's what heroes really are, not the ones with capes and superpowers, the ordinary people who choose to act when they could choose to look away. The first anniversary of the Burke trial verdict fell on a crisp autumn day, and the Iron Guardians organized a memorial ride in Richard's honor. Over 200 motorcycles participated, their engines creating a thunder that could be heard for miles as they wound through the streets of Cedar Falls and out into the countryside Richard had loved. Margaret rode on the back of Cole's bike, her arms wrapped around this man who had become brother and son and friend all at once. She watched the landscape flow past, the farms and forests and small towns that made up the world Richard had served for 30 years. She felt his presence in the wind, in the warmth of the sun, in the community of people who surrounded her with love. At the cemetery where Richard was buried, the riders formed a circle around his grave, and one by one they paid their respects. They spoke of lives saved, of kindness received, of the ripples that continued to spread outward from one man's compassionate heart. They spoke of Margaret, of her courage and her strength, of the way she had transformed her grief into a force for good. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she stood before the gathering with tears streaming down her face and a heart full of gratitude. 2 years ago, she said, "I thought my life was over. I thought I would spend my remaining years alone, watching everything Richard built fall apart around me. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Because Richard didn't just build a house or a garden or a career. He built something that couldn't be destroyed. He built connections. He built love. He built a family that I didn't even know existed until they showed up at my door and started fixing my fence." She paused, looking at the faces around her. Cole, Jackson, Maria, Tommy, and so many others. Strangers who had become family. Broken people who had found wholeness in each other. "I used to think that grief meant losing someone forever," she continued. "But now I understand that love doesn't work that way. Richard is here, in every one of you who carries his spirit forward. He's here in every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every decision to help someone when you could just as easily look away. He's here, and he always will be." The ride concluded at Margaret's house, where tables had been set up in the backyard for a celebration that lasted until the stars came out. There was food and music and laughter, the sounds of community and connection filling the air where silence had once reigned. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had gone home and only the core members of the Iron Guardians remained, Cole found Margaret sitting on the memorial bench beneath the oak tree. She was looking up at the sky, her face peaceful in the moonlight. "You okay?" he asked, settling onto the bench beside her. "Better than okay," she replied. "I was just thinking about what Richard would say if he could see all this." "I think I know," Cole said. "He would say that this is exactly how it's supposed to work, that we're all just passing through and the only thing that matters is what we leave behind. The kindness we show, the lives we touch, the love we share." Margaret nodded, tears flowing freely now but feeling like release rather than sorrow. "He would also say something about getting to bed at a reasonable hour," she added with a small laugh. "He was very practical about things like that." Cole laughed too, the sound rich and warm in the night air. "There's one more thing I want to tell you," he said, his voice growing serious. "When I was lying in that hospital bed, sure I was going to die, Richard sat with me and told me something I've never forgotten. He said that the universe has a way of balancing things out, that for every act of cruelty, there's an act of compassion waiting to happen. That for every person who takes, there's someone who gives, and that our job, the only job that really matters, is to make sure we're on the right side of that equation." Margaret reached for his hand, holding it tightly. "He told me that too," she said, "on our wedding night. He said he wanted to spend his life adding to the love in the world, not taking away from it. And he did. Right up until the end, he did. And now you're doing the same," Cole said. "And so am I. And so are all of us." The equation keeps balancing over and over as long as there are people willing to choose love over fear. They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the stars wheel overhead, feeling the presence of those who had come before and those who would come after. The fence that Cole had fixed so many months ago stood strong and straight in the darkness, a simple thing that had become a symbol of so much more. "Thank you," Margaret finally said, "for everything, for fixing the fence, for fighting for me, for being here when I needed someone most." Cole squeezed her hand gently. "Thank Richard," he said. "He's the one who started it all. I'm just trying to live up to his example. We all are." In the months that followed, Margaret's life settled into a new rhythm. She returned to nursing part-time, working at a community health clinic that served low-income families. The work was different from the hospital, slower, more personal. She had time to sit with patients, to listen to their stories, to offer the kind of compassionate care that Richard had always practiced. The Iron Guardians remained a constant presence in her life, showing up for Sunday dinners and holidays, calling to check on her during the week, including her in their charity events and community service projects. She became their unofficial den mother, the one who made sure they ate properly and took care of themselves the way they took care of everyone else. Emily moved back to Tennessee the following year, taking a position with a Nashville firm that allowed her to work more closely with the Richard Callaway Foundation. She had changed in ways that surprised even Margaret, the hard edges of her corporate persona softening into something more compassionate. She started dating one of the younger Iron Guardians, a software engineer named Marcus, who had joined the club after losing his father to the same kind of predatory practices they now fought against. The foundation grew beyond anyone's expectations, expanding to cover 5 states and helping thousands of families protect their homes from developers, scammers, and predatory lenders. Margaret served on the board of directors, her nursing background proving invaluable in developing programs that addressed not just the legal aspects of elder protection, but the emotional and physical health impacts as well. On the 3rd anniversary of Richard's death, Margaret woke early and drove to the cemetery alone. She sat by his grave as the sun rose, talking to him the way she always did, telling him about the foundation and the Iron Guardians and Emily's engagement to Marcus. She told him about the cases they had won, the families they had helped, the lives that had been changed because of the ripples he had set in motion so many years ago. And then she told him the things she had been building up the courage to say for months. "I'm going to be okay, Richard," she said. "I'm going to miss you every day for the rest of my life, but I'm going to be okay. You gave me everything I needed, not just during our marriage, but in the people you left behind. Cole and the Guardians and everyone at the foundation. They're your gift to me, your last act of love. And I promise you, I'm going to honor that gift by living fully, loving completely, and never stopping the fight for the things we believed in together." She placed a small bouquet of flowers on his grave, the same white roses he had given her on their wedding day, and she walked back to her car with her head held high. Behind her, unseen, Cole Brennan stood among the trees, watching over her as he always did. He had followed her here not to intrude but to protect, to make sure she was safe on this difficult morning. When she was gone, he approached the grave himself and knelt in the dewy grass. "I made you a promise, brother," he said quietly. "I promised I'd take care of her. And I have. But she doesn't need taking care of anymore. She's strong now. Stronger than she ever knew she could be. That's your doing. That's your legacy. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure the world knows about it." He stood, touched the headstone gently, and walked back to his motorcycle. The engine roared to life, the sound carrying across the peaceful cemetery, and he rode off into the morning light. If you watched this far, it's because you felt this story in your heart. You felt the power of unexpected kindness, the strength of chosen family, and the hope that comes when good people stand together against those who would harm the vulnerable. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. The transformation of Margaret Calloway from grieving widow to community leader became legend in Cedar Falls. People who had known her for years spoke of her with new respect, marveling at the strength they had never suspected lay beneath her gentle exterior. Newcomers heard stories of the nurse whose home had become the heart of a movement, whose love for her deceased husband had sparked a revolution in elder protection that was now being studied as a model for programs nationwide. But Margaret never saw herself as anything special. When reporters asked her how she had found the courage to stand up to powerful developers, when community groups invited her to speak about her journey, when young activists sought her advice on how to organize for change, she always gave the same answer. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she would say. "I just opened my door when a stranger knocked. I listened to his story. I accepted his help. And when the time came to help others, I remembered what my husband always taught me. That we're all connected. That what we do for the least of us, we do for all of us. That love, real love, never dies. It just keeps spreading, from one heart to the next, forever." 5 years after Cole Brennan first appeared at her fence, Margaret hosted what had become the annual Richard Calloway Memorial Dinner, an event that now drew hundreds of supporters from across the country. The backyard that had once been overgrown and neglected was now a beautiful garden, meticulously maintained by volunteers who treated it as sacred ground. The house that had once been falling apart was now a showpiece, its fresh paint and solid structure a testament to what community could accomplish. The dinner was a celebration of everything the foundation had achieved. Over 5,000 families helped, 3 major pieces of legislation passed, dozens of predatory companies shut down or reformed. But it was also a celebration of the human connections that made all of it possible. The people gathered on Margaret's lawn were not just donors and volunteers and beneficiaries, they were family. Cole gave the keynote speech that year, standing before the crowd with the same leather vest he had worn the day he first showed up to fix a widow's fence. His voice cracked several times as he spoke, the emotion of 5 years of memories too powerful to contain. "We came together because of one man's kindness," he said. "Richard Calloway saved my life when I was nobody, when I had nothing, when I didn't even believe I deserved to keep breathing. He saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, and because of that, I'm standing here today. Because of that, this foundation exists. Because of that, thousands of people have been protected from those who would prey on them." He paused, looking out at the faces before him. People of all ages, all backgrounds, all walks of life, united not by blood or geography or politics, but by a shared commitment to protecting the vulnerable. "But here's what I've learned in these 5 years," he continued. "Richard wasn't unique. There are people like him everywhere. People with compassion and courage and the willingness to act. The only difference is that Richard chose to use those gifts every single day, in every situation, with every person he met. He didn't wait for the big moments. He made every moment big." Cole's voice steadied as he delivered his final words. That's what he taught me. That's what he taught all of us. That every act of kindness matters. That every moment of courage counts. That we don't have to wait for permission or opportunity or perfect circumstances. We just have to decide, right now, to be the person someone else needs us to be. That's the legacy Richard left us, and that's the legacy we pass on to everyone we help. The crowd erupted in applause, and Margaret rose from her seat to embrace Cole, tears streaming down both their faces. Around them, the Iron Guardians formed a protective circle, their leather and chrome gleaming in the evening light, their faces reflecting the love and respect they felt for the woman who had become their heart. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the cleanup was underway, Margaret walked through her garden alone. She touched the roses she had planted in Richard's memory, breathed in their sweet fragrance, and felt his presence as strongly as she had on their wedding day. "We did it, Richard," she whispered. "We built something beautiful. Something that will last long after I'm gone. Something that proves what you always believed. That love is the only thing that really matters." The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and eternal, and Margaret Calloway stood in her garden feeling more alive than she had in years. She had lost her husband, had nearly lost herself in the grief that followed. But she had found something unexpected in the darkness. A stranger on a motorcycle. A community of broken people made whole. A purpose that gave meaning to her remaining years. And above all, she had found proof that the things we do for love never really die. They just keep spreading outward from one heart to the next, changing the world in ways we can never fully see. The fence Cole had fixed still stood strong along the eastern property line, its white paint gleaming in the moonlight. It was just a fence, just wood and nails and paint. But it was also so much more. It was the first gesture in a chain of kindness that had transformed a grieving widow into a community leader, a group of bikers into a family, and a quiet suburban street into the birthplace of a movement. It was proof that the walls we build can either divide us or protect us, depending on who does the building and why. And it was a reminder that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply show up. With our tools and our time and our willingness to help, and trust that the rest will follow. The night deepened around Margaret's garden, peaceful and full of promise. Somewhere in the distance, a motorcycle engine rumbled, the sound carrying on the wind like a benediction. She smiled, knowing it was Cole or one of the other guardians, making their nightly rounds, watching over her as they always did. And she walked back into the house that love had rebuilt, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Because that's what family does. They show up, they stay, and they never, ever let you face the darkness alone. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of kindness and community and love that transcends death, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories that remind you of the goodness in humanity. And leave a comment telling us your own story of unexpected kindness, of strangers who became family, of love that changed everything. Because these stories are everywhere. They're happening right now, in towns and cities all over the world. And sometimes all it takes to find them is to open your door, accept the help that's offered, and trust that the universe knows exactly what it's doing. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing. And thank you for being part of this community of hope. Until next time, remember, love never dies. It just keeps spreading from one heart to the next forever.